His is a memoir that has far-reaching implications beyond his own family narrative. Israeli historian Avi Shlaim shattered many historical myths with the release of his book, Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Avi Shlaim is an Israeli-British historian of Iraqi descent, an emeritus fellow of St. Anthony's College, and emeritus professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. His forthcoming book, Genocide in Gaza, Israel, Hamas, and the Long War on Palestine, is due in the new year, but you can now pre-order, and I highly recommend you do so. Avi Shlaim joins me now. Welcome to On the Line, Professor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
I would like to start with your memoir, and I want to start with the term Arab Jew. Can you take me through how you use that term and what it means to you?
Yes, this is a very good place to start a discussion of my book, because the book revolves around the pivotal concept of the Arab Jew. And I define an Arab Jew as a Jew who lived in an Arab country. So I clearly fit into this category because I lived in Iraq up to the age of 5, and then I grew up in Israel. So I'm an Arab Jew. Now, this is the narrow definition, and we are a dying breed. There aren't that many Jews today who lived in an Arab country. But the broader category is that of Jews of Arab descent. So many Jews in Israel who were born in Israel, but their parents or grandparents came from an Arab country. So that also could qualify as an Arab Jew. But the concept of Arab Jew is very controversial in Israel, because Israelis think that the term doesn't make any sense, that it's a contradiction in terms, that it's an ontological impossibility. They say that if you are a Jew, you cannot be an Arab, and if you are an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. It's one or the other. And this is where I disagree, and this is why I chose the Memoirs of an Arab Jew as a subtitle for my book, because there is no better way of defining my initial identity as that of an Arab Jew. We were a Jewish family living in Baghdad, and we were Arab Jews in every sense of the word. So that's my justification.
I want to come to this, what you refer to as an ontological impossibility. What purpose does that serve, this construct of, you called it an ontological impossibility in your book? What purpose does that serve?
The term Arab Jew defines an identity that existed in the past in the Middle East, and a very important identity. And the hyphen in Arab Jew, for me, is not something that divides Arabs from Jews. On the contrary, for me, it's the hyphen that unites the two sides of my personality, the two aspects of my identity. And my book has aroused quite a lot of interest in the Arab world, and there is now, it's just come out, an Arabic edition of my book, published by a Kuwaiti publisher called Takween. The book has just come out in Arabic, and the book has aroused a lot of interest in the Arab world. And the reason for this is that any Arab born after 1948, after the State of Israel was established in 1948, would have no idea of how different the face of the Middle East was before the emergence of Israel, before the emergence of Zionism and the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. There were thriving Jewish communities throughout the Arab world, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Egypt, throughout North Africa. Thriving Jewish communities who lived cheek by jowl with their Muslim neighbors.
I want to come to those. Sorry to interrupt you, because I do want to come to those communities. But I want to come back to this idea that you talked about a contradiction in terms, because we always hear, French Jews, German Jews. Why is Arab Jew so contested?
The term Arab Jew is bitterly contested by Israelis because they are nationalists. Zionism is a nationalist movement. And nationalism is a negative and divisive force. Patriotism is love of one's country. For nationalism, you need an enemy. Zionism is a nationalist movement, and therefore it needs an enemy, and it thrives on conflict. And that's why the term is contested, because nationalism has been a very destructive force everywhere, including the Middle East. And the world that I described earlier, the Middle East, in which there was coexistence between Jews and Muslims and Christians, this world was blown away in the 20th century by the cold winds of nationalism. That's why the term is contested, because if you're a nationalist, a committed nationalist, then you can't be anything else. You can't have another ethnic identity. And this is precisely what I'm challenging. I'm saying I'm an Arab Jew. I'm both an Arab and a Jew. Moreover, I'm proud both of my Arab heritage and of my Jewish heritage. So for me, there is no conflict between the two.
You begin the memoir by writing, "If I had to identify one key factor that shaped my early relationship to Israeli society, it would be an inferiority complex. I was an Iraqi boy in a land of Europeans." In what ways did Israeli society make you feel inferior as a child?
Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. The leaders of the Zionist movement had very little interest in the Jews of the East. They rather looked down on the Jews of the East. They looked down on Arabs as backward, as primitive, and Oriental Jews were just a little bit better than Arabs, but still inferior to European Jews. It's only after the Holocaust that Zionist leaders developed an interest in Oriental Jews, because the Holocaust removed the main reservoir of Jews for the Jewish state to be. So now, after the Second World War, Zionist leaders had to look for Jews wherever they could find them, in all four corners of the earth, including the Middle East. So that's the background to Israel. And that's why I felt out of place, marginalized in this newly established Israeli society, because it was a European creation. It was the elites, all the elites, the political, the cultural, the military elites were European Jews. They were Ashkenazi Jews. And the whole society had a European ethos. Moreover, Israel never wanted to integrate into the Middle East. Israel always saw itself as a country apart, a country with close connections with Europe and with Western civilization. It didn't want to integrate. It was a fortress, Israel. And I felt this as a young boy, that this is a European project, and everything European was considered superior, and everything Arab was considered inferior, and the Arabic language was considered to be an ugly, guttural, primitive language. So I was embarrassed when my father spoke to me in Arabic in front of my Israeli friends. But more generally, I internalized the values of my new society. It's not that I confronted direct discrimination because I was an Oriental boy. It was something less tangible. I saw the atmosphere around me. I saw the values of this society, and I felt that I wasn't good enough, that I was inferior. And it was this sense of inferiority that held me back and rather blighted my childhood in Israel.
It's interesting you use the term out of place, and it reminded me of Edward Said's memoir, title of his memoir, Out of Place. You actually
Indeed.
Yes, you actually referred to, go ahead, sorry.
Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, is the best autobiography that I've ever read.
Me too.
So I strongly recommend it to your readers. But I have no pretensions. I had no pretension to be, for my autobiography, to be anything like the literary quality and psychological depth of his book. But I did my best in writing not a conventional autobiography, but part autobiography about my childhood in Israel, but more importantly, a history of the Jews in Iraq. So I think of my book as an impersonal autobiography, half autobiography, half history of the Jews in Iraq, and the exodus from Iraq to Israel.
Coming back to the Arabic language, you actually referred to it as the language of the enemy, that it was the language, that it was seen as the language of the enemy in Israel, and sort of this cultural idea that you say you took on as a child. But as you got older, how did that change for you? How did the language change for you?
I was 5 years old when we left Baghdad to go to Israel. It was before I started going to school. So at home in Israel, we spoke Arabic, but I couldn't read or write Arabic. And my father couldn't speak Hebrew. So my sisters and I picked up Hebrew very quickly at school, as children do. And between us, we spoke Hebrew. But our parents spoke to us in Arabic, and we replied in Hebrew. And Arabic was the language of the enemy, so we were embarrassed to be heard speaking Arabic, and I thought it was a great disadvantage to be an Iraqi boy and to be Arabic speaking. It's only when I grew up and became a historian of the Arab-Israeli conflict that I realized that this was an asset, an advantage, rather than a problem or a liability. Because I grew up in an Arab country, I could treat Arabs as human beings rather than as the enemy. For my family and me, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not an abstract idea or a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. So for me, this was a great advantage as a history because I could empathize with the Arabs, especially with the Palestinians, because I had the actual experience of living with them.
Your childhood in Iraq, the way you write about it, sounds really magical. In general, how would you describe the 100,000 plus population of Iraqi Jews? How were they governed? How were they viewed in Iraq?
To answer your question, I would like to go back to the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire, for all its faults, allowed a high degree of autonomy, of cultural and religious autonomy to all the minorities, and there were many minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and the Jews thrived under the Ottoman Empire. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we saw the emergence of a number of Arab states, including Iraq. But the same Ottoman tradition, political culture, continued in the successor states. So in Iraq, you had a large number of minorities. There were Christians, there were Chaldeans, the Turkomans, the Circassians, there were Jews, and the Jews didn't stand out. There were one minority among many. And Iraq didn't have a Jewish problem in inverted commas. Europe had an had a Jewish problem. In Europe, the Jews were symbolic of the other. In Iraq, there were just one group of people, one minority, who spoke Arabic, who were Arabs to every intent and purposes, except for their religion. So we were Iraqi first and Jewish second. So, and there was a long tradition of religious tolerance between the different minorities. It was the rise of nationalism, as I said earlier, both Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism or Zionism, that began to erode that ancient Ottoman political culture and to create a division between Jews and Muslims. And with the emergence of the State of Israel, anyone in Iraq who didn't like Jews would say to them, you are outsiders, you're foreigners, you don't belong here. Why don't you go and join your brothers in the new State of Israel? So Zionism changed this political setup in the Middle East, because Zionism gave the Jews a territorial dimension for the first time in 2.5 millennia. This is the big change that happened following 1948. And also, in 1948, there was an Arab-Israeli war. The Iraqi army fought in that war, and after that war and the Arab defeat And after the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, there was a backlash against the Jews throughout the Arab world, including Iran.
You immigrated with your family to Israel in 1950. This is 2 years after the establishment of the state. Was there a particular moment for your parents, for your family, when they said, okay, this is it, we have to leave?
There wasn't one particular moment, but it was the aftermath of the 1948 war. In 1949, the Iraqi government began to persecute the Jews. So Jews were fired from their government positions. Quotas were imposed on the number of Jews who could go to university. Restrictions were imposed on the activities of Jewish financiers and merchants. So this is persecution at the official level. And alongside that, at the same time, there was popular hostility towards the Jews that hadn't existed before, at least not to the same degree. And it was popular hostility towards Israel was fueled by the Zionist takeover of Palestine and the turning of the Palestinians into a nation of refugees. So the whole climate of opinion in Iraq changed. And in 1950, there was, if you like, a turning point. Jews were allowed to leave Iraq if they wanted to. The great majority wanted to stay in Iraq. My father wanted to stay in Iraq. He was an Iraqi. But life became unsafe for the Jews. There were attacks on Jewish premises in Iraq, and my mother felt that it was unsafe for the children to stay in Iraq, so she prevailed on my father, and he agreed to leave the country and go to Israel.
I want to get to in many ways, when I was reading this memoir, this sort of revivification of a history that you say has been, quote, deliberately distorted in the service of Zionist propaganda. Can you lay that out for me, how this distortion serves the state of Israel?
Yes, there is a master Zionist narrative which says that antisemitism is endemic everywhere. Everywhere throughout history and everywhere in the world there is anti-Semitism. And therefore Israel is the only safe place for Jews. And this narrative says that after the Second World War, the Jews in the Arab world faced the imminent danger of another Holocaust. And the newly established state of Israel very nobly offered them a safe haven. That's the Zionist narrative. And the history of the Jews, the history that I talked about of harmony and coexistence between Muslims and Jews, didn't fit into this narrative. And how this narrative explains the exodus of the Jews from Iraq to Israel is the direct consequences of Iraqi anti-Semitism. The American Jewish historian Salo Baron coined the phrase the lachrymose version of Jewish history. The lachrymose version of Jewish history depicts Jewish history as a never-ending process of persecution, discrimination, violence against Jews, a process that culminated in the Holocaust, the greatest crime in human history. And the lachrymose version of Jewish history fits the Zionist narrative, but it doesn't fit the history of the Jews in the Arab world. So that's why, and that's how, the history of the Jews in the Arab world is distorted to fit in with the Zionist narrative. And I have, in my book, have asserted my right, or to use a phrase of Edward Said, I demanded permission to narrate. I demanded and asserted my right to narrate our own history, as I understand it, with lights and shadows, rather than to allow it to be incorporated into the lachrymose version of European Jewish history.
In 1995, in the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, you wrote an essay, The Debate of 1948, and in it you write, "The historian's most fundamental task is not to chronicle, but to evaluate, to subject the claims of all the protagonists to rigorous scrutiny and reject all those claims, however deeply cherished, that do not stand up." This might seem like a big question, or actually it is a big question, but how much of Israel's mythical origin story stands up to scrutiny?
This is a very big question, so I'll start with the first sentence. The historian's fundamental task is not to chronicle, but to evaluate. And that's what I regard as the task of the historian, not simply to write a chronicle of events, but to stand outside and look critically at the society. Now, I grew up in Israel. I was educated at school. I was taught the Zionist narrative about the history of the region. And it's only when I grew up and became a historian that I started going to archives, and I was able to reassess the claims of all sides in the light of the actual evidence. And the result of my research was a book called The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. And it's a history of the conflict. And most of the fundamental claims of Israel do not stand up to scrutiny. For example, a major claim is that after the guns fell silent in 1948, Israel leaders strove with all their hearts and all their minds to for peace with the Arab neighbors. But the documents in the Israeli archive paint a completely different picture. They show that the files of the Israeli Foreign Ministry were bulging at the seams with negotiations with Arab leaders. After the 1948 war, Arab rulers negotiated with Israel. King Abdullah of Jordan never stopped talking to Israel. King Farouk of Egypt, towards the end of the war, sought a way out, a peaceful settlement of the conflict Hosni Zaim of Syria negotiated with Israel and wanted a real peace and the final settlement of the conflict. So it's not true that there was no, Israel wanted peace, but there was no one to talk to on the Arab side. The truth that emerges from the documents is that all the Arab leaders were willing to negotiate. They had their demands, both for territorial changes and a return of the Arab refugees. But Israel was only prepared to make peace on the basis of the status quo without making any concessions. So that's not a commitment to peace. So at the very least, I was able to refute the Israeli claims that it was Arab intransigence that stood in the way of a settlement.
On page 26 of the memoir, you wrote, "It wasn't only the land that was partitioned, but also the past." Can you take me through what you mean by that the past was partitioned?
Yes. In 1947, the UN passed a resolution for the partition of Palestine, for partitioning mandatory Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jews accepted partition. The Palestinians rejected it because it was unfair to them, because they were the majority. It was their country. The Jews they were a minority. They owned only 7% of the land, but the UN partition plan allocated to the Jews 55% of the land. So it was an unfair, but this led to the partition of Palestine, and a new reality emerged in the aftermath of the 1948 war, with Israel, which was much larger. Israel emerged with 78% of mandatory Palestine, and the Palestinians were only 22%. Only the West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian military control. So the Jews now controlled 78% of mandatory Palestine. The land was partitioned, but the history was also partitioned, in that the history that I relate here was disregarded, and a new version of history, a Zionist version of history, gained ground, which said that the Arabs were always anti-Semitic and that they drove the Jews out of their countries, and that according to this view, what happened in 1948 is a double exodus. On the one hand, there was the Palestinian exodus from Palestine, and the Palestinians left 750,000. They left of their own free will or on orders from their leaders in the expectation of a triumphal return. But 850,000 Jews were driven off the Arab world by the Arab regimes, and most of them ended up in Israel. So in effect, it was an exchange of population. I completely reject the notion of a dual exodus, because the Palestinians were real refugees. They were driven out. They didn't leave of their own accord. They were pushed out. There was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. And we, the Arab Jews, in a real sense, were the victims of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but we were not refugees. We were not mistreated physically, and we were not driven.
Who do you think benefits most from this experiential erasure of Jewish life throughout the Middle East and North Africa?
That's a very difficult question to answer, but the erasure of this identity of Arab Jew and the history of Jewish-Muslim coexistence serves the Zionist narrative that there is a fundamental division in the region and that the Arabs don't accept Israel. They reject Israel's legitimacy. It serves the view of Israelis, for, to quote Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, who think that Israel is a villa in the jungle. That tells you everything about that Zionist, nationalistic Israeli point of view, that the Middle East is a jungle, and Israel is a villa in the jungle, a place of modernity and civilization. I completely reject this notion that the Arab-Israeli conflict is, in a broader sense, is a clash of civilizations, with Judeo-Christian civilization on the one hand and Islam on the other. I regard it as a traditional geopolitical conflict over land. There are two peoples and one land, and this is what the conflict is about.
Your new book is coming out in the next couple of months, and it directly looks at what Israel is doing today in Gaza, where you argue that the basic objective is the elimination of the native population. As you watch the horrors unfolding in Gaza and Israel's sort of steadfast denial of this genocide, what are your thoughts as a historian?
Israel is the main political progeny of Zionism. Zionism is a settler colonial state. Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. The Palestinians have been at the receiving end for the last century of both Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand and Western imperialism on the other. Without the support of Britain during the Mandate and America until today, the Zionist movement would not have been able to take over the whole of the land, nor would it be getting away with genocide today. So what I argue, and in this book, I say that I've observed Israel's conduct, particularly in Gaza, the focus of this book. And by my count, this is the 8th Israeli military offensive in Gaza since Cast-led operations since 2008. So I'm not surprised by Israel's use of force. I'm not surprised by Israel's brutality. I'm not surprised that Israel's aim is ethnic cleansing, because the logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the natives. To eliminate the natives in order to take over the land and the resources of the land. But I am surprised to see what Israel is doing in Gaza, which is to go a step further to genocide. This shocks me. So Israel's actions in Gaza are outside any framework of law or morality. And it is utterly shocking that the Western powers allow Israel to get away with it. Britain and America are not just complicit in Israel's war crimes, they are active partners in Israel's war crimes. America supplies the weapons with which Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. So I think today we're at a very critical moment in the history of the region, and I am utterly shocked every day when I watch genocide being streamlined live,
Yes.
and yet Western politicians are doing nothing about it. They are not calling Israel to order, and this exposes not just Israeli brutality, Israeli expansionism, Israel's immorality, but it also exposes the hypocrisy of the Western powers in allowing this to happen, in allowing Israel to get away literally with murder. And there is a price that everyone has to pay for this, and that is that the Western powers have completely undermined any notion of a liberal international order. The Western powers were always proud of the rule-based international order, but by allowing Israel to behave in such a brutal and genocidal manner, they undermine any claim to stand by democracy or morality or international law. And this is all the product of settler colonialism. In Gaza, we witnessed the last and the most cruel phase in this settler colonialism backed by Western imperialism.
I just want to, in keeping with that Israel's denial of genocide, of apartheid, I want to ask you about anti-Semitism and its weaponization, its usage over the past year by the state of Israel. What do you make of it?
Israel has lost the argument. There is a global grassroots movement of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This movement is non-violent. I stress, it's a non-violent movement. It's not a terrorist movement. It's a non-violence movement, and all its main demands are grounded in international law. So what is there to object to it? Israel's response is not to engage with the arguments of BDS. Israel's response is character assassination, to paint the proponents of BDS as anti-Semites. So Israel and its powerful friends in the West are deliberately weaponizing anti-Semitism. They are deliberately, I stress deliberately, not by accident, they are conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. Anti-Zionism is objection to the Zionist ideology, the official ideology of the State of Israel, but more commonly, it's criticism of specific policies of the Israeli government, like the current genocide in Gaza. And by painting critics of Israel as anti-Semites, Israel and its friends hope to silence criticisms, legitimate evidence-based criticisms of the State of Israel. This is a very disturbing phenomenon, but I think most people around the world understand that the objection to what Israel is doing is nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And this weaponization of anti-Semitism will eventually backfire, and it will damage the proponents of this argument. And Israel claims to speak on behalf of world Jewry. It has no right to claim to speak on behalf of world Jewry. It has no mandate. The Israeli government only represents Israel's citizens, not the Jews of the world. Israel claims that the only safe place for Jews in the world is Israel because of antisemitism. This is complete nonsense. Israel today is the most dangerous place for Jews to live. Israel has become a real liability, a menace to world Jewry, and a real liability, a moral liability. That is why we've seen the growth of so many Jewish groups around the world. In America, the main group is I forget the name of the group.
You mean the ones that are pushing back, like If Not Now, or
yes.
Jewish Voices for Peace?
Jewish Voices for Peace is the main group, but there are lots of others. And
Yes,
there is J
If
Street.
Not Now, J Street, Jews Against Genocide.
And in Britain, there are also many groups like Jews for Justice for Palestinians.
Yes, there's also Independent Jewish Voices.
Independent Jewish Voices, Free Speech on Israel, NAMOD, and there is a large number of European groups as well who are saying, not in our name, Israel doesn't represent them. So what you have is more and more Jews standing up in opposition to what Israel is doing. And there's been a student movement against protest against the war in Gaza. Here in Oxford, there was a very strong student protest against the war in Gaza. So people
we had one here in Toronto too.
The real issue is Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, not anti-Semitism.
Your memoir, and this is my last question for you, just your memoir offers up another vision for the future of Israel-Palestine by conjuring the past as a sort of prologue. What does that hopeful future look like for you?
The Middle East today is in a dismal state. And it's not just Gaza where genocide is being committed. Israel is carrying out ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel has extended the war to Lebanon with an attack on Hezbollah and on southern Lebanon. And the Arab world is silent in face of this assault. So the Middle East is in the most terrible state today. And I would like to look forward to a better Middle East. And the two-state solution is dead. Israel killed it with settlements, and it's just a form of words. It suits Western politicians to say we support a two-state solution. But in the meantime, Israel has got complete control of the West Bank. It's gaining permanent control over northern Gaza. So this is not I used to support a two-state solution, when I thought it was viable, but it's no longer viable. And therefore, I look to another solution. And as you pointed out, my own background, my own experience of living happily in an Arab country leads me to think that Muslim, Jewish, Arab-Jewish coexistence is still possible. So today, I translate my own experience into advocating one-state solution. One state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity. So when I march in protest marches in London with my wife and daughter, and I chant from the river to the sea, what I call for is equal rights for everyone who lives in this space. Equal rights is essential. It's an essential requirement of democracy. If you don't have equal rights, you have apartheid. So to me, the key thing is not the institutional form of a settlement, whether it's one state or two states or a confederation. What is essential for me is equal rights for everybody in this space. In other words, my approach to this conflict is humanism, and in this respect, I'm a follower of Edward Said.
What a lovely way to end. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.